everyone. So today I want to go over the age of Jackson, and it has a lot more to do with than just Andrew Jackson's presidency. It has to do with a time period in our nation's history where now it's the republic is 50 years old. We're getting this new generation of leaders who are coming um, to power, and people are very energetic. The nation is growing very rapidly. They're expanding in terms of numbers. They're moving westward in terms of economic growth. So everything is burgeoning. But more than that, too, is we get the era of the common man, where more people are able to assert their individuality. They're able to assert power. They're able to take part in government and have a say in government. They're able to affect change through this reform movement. They're able to have their own personal relationship with God and how they worship, because we get the second great awakening. But of course, that's going to happen in the next chapter. So there's a lot going on. Even though there is a lot going on in this chapter, there's only 62 slides. Sounds like a lot, but that's less than most of them. So let's see if we can get this done in under an hour. Okay, so let's look at that expansion of the ability of people take a part in government. This is politics of the common man. So one thing that's very unique about America is that everybody is seen as an equal, and you're treated as such, and everybody is supposed to have equal opportunity. Now, at this time, that was revolutionary. We don't think of it as revolutionary today because that didn't include people like me, women. It didn't include African Americans. It didn't include Native Americans. It didn't include Hispanics or other minorities. But for the time period, in comparison with other places in the world, this was revolutionary. To have people not be treated as subservient is because they were lesser than somebody else. So it's a big deal. Okay, so if you look, here are the things that your book went over as to the expansion of politics for the common man. We're going to have universal white male suffrage. That would mean that everybody who was a white man at 21 or older could vote. We'd have party nominating conventions, popular elections of the president. Even though it was still the Electoral College, the people got to choose the electors for the Electoral College instead of the late state legislatures. We get a two-party system back after the era of good feelings. We get that rise of the third parties. So we do see third parties throughout the history of the United States from this point on. They don't always happen in presidential elections. They're always there, but they don't get much say. But there are a few times that they do. There are more elected officers. We get popular campaigning that takes place, and then also the spoil system. Okay, so universal white male suffrage, this chart shows that there's a shift. If you can look at it here, you had to have property in the green, and then that was a big shift from, what is it, 1820 to 1830, that changed. Western states started adopting universal white male suffrage, and then later the eastern states followed suit. They do the same thing. So people start nominating, or actually electing, the electors to the Electoral College in 1824, but those numbers weren't large until 1840. I think it's something like 2.4 million, but this is covering it, so you can't see. All right, so we also get in party nominating conventions. It used to be that these elites at the top would choose the candidate that would be running for president or governor, Senate, or other things like that. But in the Senate, it didn't really matter because state legislators chose them. But instead, what we're going to get is big conventions. Right? The King Caucus, it used to be where these group of people within a political party, they got the say. So they were the elites, and they got to choose who were going to be our leaders. But those caucuses were replaced by the 1830s. And then what you see is that party members, they first gathered for the anti-Masonic convention, and the Freemasons were a group of elites. So this was a group or a third party that was opposed to that. So it's more open participation for people in government. Right, voter turnout was very high between 1820 and 1860. You can see this, it's about 70, 80%. So that's huge. People really feel as if they have a stake in that, and they thought it was that important to go out and vote. By 1832, every state except for South Carolina allowed popular election of the Electoral College. That means that the people got to go and elect the electors that chose the President of the United States. It used to be that the state legislators did that. And in South Carolina, the people who controlled politics there were the elite planters. They're the ones that had all the slaves, they're the ones that had all the land, and they're the ones that controlled government, and they didn't want to give that up. You're going to see too that South Carolina is really entrenched in their system down there, peculiar institution of slavery and the agrarian society that they had going on, and they were very slow to change, and they're the first to secede from the Union. All right, another thing that happened is we're going to get these two-party systems now. It's going to be the Whigs and the Democrats. The Whigs are going to shift to become the Republicans. But with this two-party system and with the people being more important in the election of the president and others, representatives, it was important to go out and get their vote. So now people start campaigning. They give parades, rallies, floats, do pamphlets, give speeches. Here's an image of Andrew Jackson standing up on top of a stagecoach giving a speech. What they would do is sometimes go from community to community, sometimes stand on a stump, give a stump speech. And now that's terminology within American politics. If a candidate like Trump or Biden or whomever, if they're going around from one location to another, even if they're giving the speech on a huge platform, a stage, they still call it a stump speech because it's the sort of the standard speech that they give from place to place. Right, we do get the rise of third parties. The two major parties are, at this time, are the Democratic Republicans. This is 1824, and the Whigs. Well, I guess this would be 1828, because the Whig Party grew as a national party in opposition to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was an elected president in 1824. He was elected in 1828, or 28, and then again in 32. So anyway, some of these third party candidates are going to be the Know Nothings, which is the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, and that's opposed to immigration, the anti-Masons who are opposed to the Freemasons, and then the Working Men's Party who is there to support the rights and working conditions of the working man. One thing that's interesting at this time, we get the introduction of the spoil system. So when Andrew Jackson comes into office, he fires all of those who were loyal to the previous leader or to the previous party, and he appoints those people who aided him in his campaign or who were very loyal to him. This term becomes known as to the victor, or the spoil system, and kind of the phrase to the victor goes the spoils. It's removing everybody and placing in people that you want. Another thing that Jackson wanted to do was kind of rotate people in office, limit their time in office so that you can put other people in there instead. And this sort of indicates his belief in the common man. It didn't need to be some elite person who had done the job for 20 years. It could be anybody, because anybody has the capability of achieving to his or her own potential and to running the government. All right, so let's look at the presidential election of 1824. We've done a lot of talking about Andrew Jackson, and he runs for president in 1824. And even though he gets more of the popular vote for the Electoral College and more of the electoral vote, he didn't become president. And here's why. Let's look at it. So you had four candidates, all from the same political party, Democratic Republicans across the board, running for president: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. John Quincy Adams had been the Secretary of State to James Monroe, and I might add, he was quite a brilliant and very successful Secretary of State. Now remember, the job of Secretary of State seemed to be like the precursor to becoming president of the United States. John Quincy Adams had been the Secretary of State to James Monroe. James Monroe had been the Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had been the Secretary of State to George Washington. So it was just kind of that progression there. So John Quincy Adams is running for president, and presumably he's going to become president because he had been Secretary of State. Andrew Jackson, he's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, and then also of Florida. He's making quite a name for himself. He's in Congress. And then there is William Crawford. To be honest with you, I don't know much about him. I do know that after this election, he had suffered from a stroke, so he's kind of out of it. Then there's Henry Clay, youngest Speaker of the House ever, great compromiser. He's running as well, and he is the Speaker of the House. That's important to note. So here are the elections. As in your book, Andrew Jackson got more of the popular vote towards the Electoral College, but it didn't matter because not every state did that. If you look at the electoral vote, though, he got more than anyone else, but he didn't get more than 50%. So he doesn't get to become president. The Constitution says from the top three, the House will decide. So it goes to the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay wasn't there because he wasn't one of the top three. It was John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. So Henry Clay is out. So then they vote on the top three. Henry Clay, who's very influential in the House of Representatives, gave his support and convinced others to support John Quincy Adams, which they did. So here's another way of looking at it. Here you got Andrew Jackson, who received the majority of the popular vote and the electoral vote. Not the majority, most. Then John Quincy Adams, who came in second, and then William Crawford came in a very close third. So it goes to the House, and then here, next slide. This shows how that vote turned out. Notice that 13 of the votes went to John Quincy Adams, which was 54%, which was more than what he needed to become president because he got the majority of the vote. So it's not the electoral vote anymore, it's what's in the House of Representatives. And so at that time, what were there? 24 states were in the Union. So the 24 states vote, and each state gets one vote. So within the state, they all have to agree, those representatives there, on who's going to be our candidate and its majority rule. So if you've got 7 people and 4 of them vote for Adams and 3 of them vote for Jackson, Adams gets the vote. So that's how it works. So John Quincy Adams becomes president. That's very fair. But because John Quincy Adams appointed Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, many people thought that this was a deal because Clay had given his support to Adams, and then Adams appoints him as Secretary of State. So they're like, this is a corrupt bargain, and supporters of Andrew Jackson feel as if he was robbed the presidency. So if we look at the presidency of John Quincy Adams, notice that he only served one term. He was inaugurated in 1825, and then Andrew Jackson's going to win the presidential election of 1828, and he's going to be inaugurated in 1829. So this is John Quincy Adams. It's an image of him, a picture taken at daguerreotype. He was very brilliant, and I think I put that down there. He has a great record, excellent Secretary of State, authored the Monroe Doctrine. So he was very competent. The thing of it is that he wasn't very well liked. He was too serious, very sarcastic. He didn't have any tact. He didn't really care for popular opinion. He did what he thought that was right, which some people thought was closed-minded. But he did work for the cause of abolition, and I thought he was pretty smart. Anyway, he also supported Henry Clay's American system. Remember, internal improvements, we need a national bank, and we need tariffs. So he wants to build roads and build up the country and that sort of thing. Now, people who supported Andrew Jackson didn't like that, so they were angered by that. He was also a very strong nationalist and supported the United States when a lot of people were more supportive of different sections of the country. I think that actually more people were both at this time. All right, so one thing that he does, And this is in 1828, when the year of a presidential election, he's up for re-election, is he signs off on the tariff of 1828. A lot of the people who support Andrew Jackson made this an issue. They wanted it to be on there to make Adams look bad so that it would be easier for Jackson to win the presidency. It passed through Congress by a very narrow vote. If you look up here, it's 105 to 94. So it went through Congress, and Adams signed it. He thought that it would be a good idea. He is from the Northeast. He is from Massachusetts, and he wanted to help the industry up in that area. So it levied this high duty on a lot of products that people needed: molasses, distilled spirits, or wanted, flax, and other finished goods. And it was very unpopular because what it did is it really raised the price of goods coming into the country. It was protective in nature to protect New England and the Northeast, because that's where a lot of the industry was. The problem with it came to the South and the West, because that increased the price of goods for them, because it offset, if they wanted to buy something from um, the North, then the North could raise their prices a little bit because they don't have to compete with foreign products. For foreign products, it raised the price with the price of the tariff. And so it was more expensive. Not only that, it hurt the South because England said, well, if you're imposing tariffs on us, our goods going into your country, we're going to impose tariffs on your goods. And so that raised the price of cotton coming from America to British manufacturers. And the British manufacturers like, we can get our cotton cheaper from someone else. Why don't we go through India, which was one of their colonies, and they had produced cotton. And so they started to do that. So now for the South, not only did they have to pay higher price for goods, they also got less for their cotton, and they were selling less. So it was very problematic for the South. Southern response came from John C. Calhoun. Although he didn't admit it at the time, he wrote the South Carolina Exposition, and in it he articulated the doctrine of nullification. He reasserted states' rights to reject federal law if that law was deemed by the state to be unconstitutional. This is very similar to what Madison and Jefferson did with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions on the issue of the Alien and Sedition Acts. They're like, no, we deem this to be an unconstitutional law. We're not going to abide by it. You can see some other states doing the same thing sometimes throughout history. Texas didn't like Obamacare, right? So it's issues like that. Where does the power of the state and the federal government, where does it differ? So he didn't admit he did it at the time, but later in 1832 with the new tariff, he would admit to doing it. Keep in mind that at this time, Calhoun is the vice president under John Quincy Adams. Weird thing is, he's also going to be the vice president under Andrew Jackson. All right, so that brings us to the election of 1828. And this link right here is that one video um, from Bloody Bloody Jackson, populism. Yeah, yeah. All right, so in the presidential election of 1828, it was an ugly presidential election. Both sides are lobbying attacks on the candidates' wives. So supporters of Jackson saying that John Quincy Adams' wife was born out of wedlock. I don't know if that's true or not. I suppose I could do some research, Google it, and find out pretty fast. Supporters of John Quincy Adams accused Jackson's wife of committing adultery because she wasn't legally divorced from her first husband when she was married and living with Andrew Jackson. So this was really tough, I guess, on Rachel Jackson. Andrew Jackson's going to get elected president, but between the time that he's elected and the time that he's inaugurated, she's going to die. I don't know what she died from, but if it was the stress, maybe a heart attack or something. All right, so here's the presidential election of 1828. You can see up in the north in New England, the Northeast, John Quincy Adams wins, but New York is split, and the rest of the country goes for Jackson, especially all the South and all of the West. All right, so let's look at the presidency of Andrew Jackson. There's like four main things. You're going to have the Peggy Eaton affair. So basically, that says more about Jackson and his cabinet. You're also going to have the Indian Removal Act. There's going to be the bank war, and then the nullification crisis over the tariff of abominations. All right, so if we look at Andrew Jackson as a character, there's never been anybody like him as the President of the United States. They called him Old Hickory because he was tough as hickory wood. I suppose hickory's really tough. So that's why they called him that. He was tall and very thin, but really rough around the edges. He liked to fight Indians. He saw himself as the supporter of the common man. He had some bouts of illness because he was prone to have duels and fights. He always won, from what I understand. But he did walk around with a couple of bullets in him, so he was suffering from lead poisoning, and he would spit up blood and that sort of thing. So he wasn't very healthy. He was born in Carolina, but then they moved out west to Tennessee. He was a military hero of the War of 1812 because of the Battle of New Orleans. He was only the second president without a degree. The first was George Washington. He'd served in Congress, and he's the first president who was nominated at a party convention. He was a very strong leader. He didn't get along with his cabinet. He kept close people who were close to him, close by as his advisors, and he is the symbol of the common man. Right? If you look here, like I said, he championed common man. And the group of people who supported him were the poorer people in the South, not these big plantation owners, even though he had a plantation in Tennessee not far from Nashville. It's called the Hermitage. You can go and visit it today, see that there are, I believe they're reconstructed slave quarters, and you can see the home. It's all right. I mean, it's nice, I guess. He also was supported by people on the frontier states, especially states' writers, and then also people who wanted to get government jobs because of the spoil system, and manufacturer or people who worked in manufacturing companies, so people who worked as laborers, including immigrants to the cities. Um, what he saw himself as the champion of this common man is that he's going to take down this privilege that other people have. He thinks that it's unfair. And as I said, he kept some close advisors near him. That group of people, they weren't appointed, they weren't approved by the Senate. They were just his good friends who he trusted, and they were called the kitchen cabinet. All right, so the first thing he's dealing with is this Peggy Eaton affair. Peggy Eaton is this charismatic, vivacious woman who worked as like a barmaid in Washington, D.C., where Andrew Jackson and his Secretary of War, John Eaton, would go for entertainment. Well, John Eaton and Peggy Eaton, her name at the time was not Peggy Eaton, um, they got along well, and she would accompany him to different social events. The problem was is that she was married to this guy who was in the Navy. And John Eaton, he's the Secretary of War, so he's really high up here, and her husband was like down there somewhere. Um, so he dies, and rumor has it he died because he committed suicide because he found out that she was having an affair with John Eaton. We don't know if that's true or not. But after he dies, she marries John Eaton, and then rumor has it that, well, they had been having an affair and this sort of thing. So she's kind of ostracized. Nobody wants to be around her. They're like socially unacceptable to hang out with. And these are the people within Andrew Jackson's cabinets. Their wives are like, oh no, we're not going to hang out with this hussy, right? And this makes Jackson upset because of the way that his wife had been treated. The person who, or the people who lead this sort of ostracism of Peggy Eaton and John Eaton are the Calhouns. John C. Calhoun, who is Andrew Jackson's vice president, just like he had been John Quincy Adams' vice president. Um, and so they reject them socially, except for Martin Van Buren. So this really irritates Jackson. Van Buren's status is elevated, but Jackson can't work with his cabinet. Eventually, after a year, he asked his cabinet to resign. And this political cartoon is supposed to illustrate that these rats that are fleeing, they have the heads and the faces of various cabinet members. I'm pretty sure one of them, though, is Martin Van Buren, who is going to be the president of the United States after Andrew Jackson. So this is supposed to depict Jackson just overwhelmed by what's going on, these rats, these dirty rats. And he did have this transition of people in his cabinet. It just kind of kept changing over time very quickly. Another thing that occurred during Andrew Jackson's presidency is probably one of the darker, if not the darkest, between that and slavery, one of the darker chapters in American history, and that was the removal of the Native Americans from the eastern part of the United States across the Mississippi River to Indian lands that were set aside for them. Even though these people didn't want to leave their ancestral homelands, they were forced to do so so that white people could move into their land. So Native Americans were considered by white people, Europeans who had come and the generations that followed here in America, as the noble savage, which wasn't a derogatory term to many people, because what it implies is they held them in high regard. As a matter of fact, so much so that they wanted to assimilate them into American society. They kind of had respect for them. They admired the way that they carried themselves, their pride, their honor, that sort of thing. So white people looked up to them. There were efforts to civilize them, as you can see right here. There was Society for the Propagating of the Gospel among the Indians, and this sort of idealism was going to continue, even though Native Americans didn't want to become assimilated into American society. As a matter of fact, many white people who were captured and by Native Americans and then had to live among them later, when they were quote unquote freed, they wanted to go back to the way that they had lived. Rarely, if ever, that I know of, when an Indian was placed in American society, did they ever want to stay. If given the opportunity, they wanted to leave. As a matter of fact, Benjamin Franklin noted this early on about that. So Native American society, people seem to be quite comfortable with, perhaps because it wasn't this high expectation for achievement. Everybody just kind of worked together collectively and accepted one another for who they were. That's just what some people opine. But so there were these efforts to bring them in. They even, tried to teach them English and make them be more individualistic by teaching them agricultural and vocational training. And this is going to continue for quite some time, and it's only going to intensify efforts by the government to assimilate Native Americans into our culture. Um, so anyway, here's an example of the noble savage. This is a painting, a very famous painting of the death of General James Wolfe at the Battle of Quebec in 1759 during the French and Indian War, the decisive victory, I might add. There's a Native American there just very contemplating, much like the thinker. Others are kind of hysteric about what's going on, but the Native American is just contemplating it. So that's kind of a depiction, or is shown as an example of the noble savage. So the people that were most impacted by the Indian Removal Act were what's been known, or people have been called, the five civilized tribes. You have the Cherokee, which is the largest group here, and then the Cree, the second largest. Down in Florida are the Seminoles, and what is mostly Mississippi today are the Choctaw, and then in between the Choctaw and the Cherokee are the Chickasaw. These are known as the five civilized tribes because what they had done is that they were living pretty much like white people. They were sedentary agricultural farmers. Some of them had plantations, some of them had slaves. They lived much as white people did. The only reason that they were being forced to move is because of their DNA, because of the color of their skin. In many regards, they were exactly like white people. But the idea was, let's move them away so that white people can move in there. Here's some images of leaders of the 5 different tribes, very noble people. Okay, so this is the Indian Removal Act. It required that all Native Americans resettle west of the Mississippi River, and that freed up 25 million acres of good farmland, land to be settled on by white people in Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. It also created the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which were supposed to assist them in their resettlement. The resettlement was going to be in Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma. So about 46,000 people were relocated by the military to the Indian Territory. This forced location, especially of the Cherokee, is known as the Trail of Tears. So here's the trail that they took. You have the Seminole from Florida, and then the Creek from Alabama, the Choctaw from Mississippi, same as the Chickasaw. But the Cherokee noticed their route. They went all the way up into Illinois, grabbing on different groups along the way. So sometimes the route kind of moved along. Their route was the most arduous and the most deadly. So the Cherokee tried to fight this. Rather than going to war, they went to court. So Georgia had passed laws requiring that the Cherokee relocate. The Cherokee argued to the Supreme Court that they were sort of like this independent entity that they didn't have to. So Chief John Ross, the man pictured here, is the leader of the Cherokee who argued this on behalf of the tribe. And he was assisted by this lawyer by the name of William Wirt. The court ruled, though, that they had no right to bring the suit because they weren't an independent country. So the Supreme Court only hears cases as original jurisdiction that are federal laws, deal with foreign countries, deal with admiralty law or the Constitution. And in this case, it didn't merit that. So they didn't even hear this. So then the Cherokee, there was another Supreme Court case dealing with the Cherokee in Georgia. This one was filed by this white guy named Samuel Worcester. Now, Samuel Worcester was a missionary. He and others were on Cherokee land, and they were trying to spread the gospel, and also they were helping the Cherokee in resisting government laws that were going to kick them off of their territory, basically resisting the Indian Removal Act. So they were there, but then Georgia passed a law forbidding white people from living on Cherokee land, which of course is unconstitutional. So the guy Worcester, he files case and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that Georgia has no right and no authority within the territory of the Cherokee. And it also basically said that they cannot be removed from their land, and Jackson didn't care. He didn't enforce this. Instead, what he's going to do is he's going to send the military down there to remove the Cherokee from their land, and that is what they did. Not only that, the state of Georgia was rallying the militia to go kick them off of the land. So the Cherokee could resist physically, or they could just go. And John Ross, the leader of the Cherokee, said, "Well, I encourage you all to just go, because then fewer people will die." So this is the trek in this map right here, where the military went from house to house, where the Cherokee lived in Tennessee, northern Georgia, northern Alabama, to move the Cherokee from that territory, their ancestral territory, to Indian lands in Oklahoma. This became known as the Trail of Tears because of the 15,000 people who were forced marched to Oklahoma. About 4,000 of them died. They were walking in the middle of winter. They didn't have enough provisions. And so a lot of people succumbed to the environment, to the conditions, and they died along the way. Also, it wasn't just the 5 civilized tribes. There's a group of people up here in Illinois, the Sauk and the Fox Indians. They were led by a Native American by the name of Chief Blackhawk here in Illinois, and then up in Wisconsin too. The Blackhawk had crossed over the Mississippi to try to evade forcing, the army from forcing them west. So they went into Iowa, but they were forced back because the Sioux didn't want them in their territory. So they returned to Illinois, and Black Hawk, one of the chiefs of the Sauk and the Fox Indians, he refused to go. So the government sent in the military. Some of them include General Winfield Scott, Jefferson Davis, who would become the president of the Confederacy, and of course Abraham Lincoln, who would become the president of the United States. They are some of the soldiers who fought in this war, the Black Hawk War. Abraham Lincoln, like others, he would be called up as a member of the militia. This slide shows an image of Chief Black Hawk, who led the Fox and the Sox in the Black Hawk Wars against the federal government in their effort to move them across the Mississippi River. You can see too, up in the border between Illinois and Wisconsin, that is where a lot of the fighting took place. Chief Black Hawk tried to flee up from Illinois north into Wisconsin, where they could live with the Winnebagos, but later he was returned to the authorities and he died in Iowa in 1838. Another effort by the federal government to remove Native Americans occurred in Florida against the Seminole. It wasn't just the Seminole, but it was also freed or, escaped African Americans, people who had been enslaved who went down to Florida to try to gain their freedom. So you can see here there are wars 1816 to 1818. That was before the Indian Removal Act. So the Second Seminole War, 1835, 1842, those occurred in various locations. And then the Third Seminole War, that's further south in Florida, and also to the far north up there, but most of the battles took place in the south. Um, Fighting against the Seminoles, trying to remove them. There was a reservation that was later designated for the Seminoles, and that's in 1842 when we get the reservation system. The Seminole were the most successful in repelling attacks against the federal government in their efforts to remove them because the terrain. You have alligators, you have swamps, you have all these different terrain that the Seminole know, and the federal government does not. So it was difficult fighting them there. Osceola was the Seminole leader, and I never say that right. He was seized when he was carrying a white flag, right? So he's carrying the flag, he's surrendering, but he was seized then. All total, about 4/5 of all the Seminole were eventually relocated to Oklahoma. So this is a caricature, an image done by a great cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who's going to make a huge impact on politics in America during the 1800s. Here it's showing, the white father, the paternalistic attitude that the American government took against the Native Americans, believing that white people had to take care of Native Americans. Native Americans, of course, didn't believe that they needed to be taken care of. So this is a condescending look, or sort of a disapproving viewpoint of Andrew Jackson and his treatment of the Native Americans. And you have to wonder, how could the Jackson administration or his supporters ever think for a minute that they were protecting the Native Americans by removing them? Some people argued that in this way that their culture would be maintained. They wouldn't be assaulted by white people in the area, and they would have an area that would be reserved for them forever, until it wasn't. This is the designated land for the Indians, the various Indian tribes. You could see up there in the north, you have the Cherokee, and then you have the Choctaw in the southeastern part, the Chickasaw the middle southern part, even the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. These are some Native American groups who are from the American Southwest. Even areas that weren't part of the United States at that time. So this would be later. Then all of that land was opened up in 1891. The government opened it up at high noon. I forget what day exactly. Some people snuck in early and they laid claim to some land. They're known as the Sooners. So you have the Boomers and the Sooners in Oklahoma. And now I think their football team is the Oklahoma Sooners. A third thing that occurred during Andrew Jackson's administration was the nullification crisis. This is kind of the precursor to what's going to happen with the South seceding. It starts in South Carolina. So this conflict wasn't over slavery, though. It was over the Tariff of Abominations. And this had to do with the Tariff of 1828, which, as we talked about previously, when John Quincy Adams was president, he signed off on this tariff. And John C. Calhoun, his vice president, wrote the South Carolina Exposition, in which they asserted nullification, whereby they said that if a federal law is deemed unconstitutional by the state, then it is null and void in that state. That created a real crisis in America at the time. And here's why. The debate about it moved into the Senate when South Carolina ruled that the Tariff of Abomination of 1828 was unconstitutional. The debate then moved to the Senate, where a man by the name of Robert Haynes spoke on behalf of South Carolina, asserting nullification. Then Daniel Webster, and by the way, this Robert Haynes was speaking on behalf of John C. Calhoun, who could not speak because Calhoun was the Vice President of the United States, and as such, he has no ability to debate in the Senate. So then Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, he gives up and he gives a speech which most people believe is the most eloquent speech ever given on the Senate floor. In it, he asserts that the government, the federal government, was created, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. Those words were so profound that Lincoln's going to use those in the Gettysburg Address when he said government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So here's an image, Daniel Webster to the left. He is still idolized in the Senate. And also, if you go to Boston, you can see places where it's like John F. Kennedy sat here, Daniel Webster sat here. He is a son of Massachusetts, and they love him there. And then here, this is Robert Haynes on the right, who is speaking on behalf of his state, South Carolina, but also on behalf of John C. Calhoun. So anyway, South Carolina then goes and holds this special convention. They're going to nullify the tariff of 1828, and then there's a new tariff of 1832 that just stirs things up. So they approve this resolution, which they say that the tariff in South Carolina was forbidden, and they weren't going to uphold it. It was null, void, illegal. Well, Andrew Jackson responds by getting Congress to pass this force bill, which would enable him to use the military to march on South Carolina to enforce the law. Jackson also encourages, he issues a proclamation stating that nullification and disunion was treasonous. Calhoun supposedly was fearing for his life. Jackson, at the same time, he suggests that Congress come up with some sort of deal to lower the tariff. So what happens is there's a compromise. And of course, the great compromiser, Henry Clay, puts this forward. It is the Compromise of 1833. It was passed in March of that year. And what they said is they were going to lower the rates of the tariff over a 10-year period to where it would go down to the same rates that it was in 1816. This compromise ended the nullification crisis. And even though Jackson supported the South on the issue of slavery, he was opposed to them on this. And you could see the real assertion of executive power. He also used executive power to prohibit any anti-slavery legislation from being gone or passed through the mail by the U.S. Mail Service. All right, last thing, the big last thing that occurred during Jackson's administration was the bank war. Seems like a lot of crises. This, though, is going to roll over to the crisis of 1837, which was a panic of 1837, another depression in our nation's history. So the bank war started because for several reasons, but it came up for recharter in 1832, even though it wasn't supposed to expire until 1836. The reason it came up in 32 is because that was an election year. Jackson was up for re-election and Henry Clay was going to run against him. Henry Clay was friends with Nicholas Biddle, who was the president of the bank. So Biddle pushed through, or he filed for recharter early. Henry Clay did this because he believed that if Jackson vetoed the bank bill, that would upset people in the Northeast. And if he signed it, that would upset people in the West and in the South. So it would be a win-win for Clay in running against Jackson in the presidential election of 1832. Now, Jackson opposed the bank. He believed that it was a huge monopoly, that it was controlled by the elites and foreigners, and that it was unconstitutional. So he vetoes the bank bill. In many people's mind, this overrides the Supreme Court case McCulloch versus Maryland. Um, but the opponent, and so these people who oppose what Jackson did call him King Andrew. Now you can see this cartoon to the left here. This is a cartoon that came out as a result of that. Here he is dressed as a king, asserting that he is not governing as a democratic leader, but rather as an autocratic leader, a tyrant, right? A monarch. So he's dressed like a king. He's got a crown on and everything else. He's standing on top of the Constitution and it's all torn up. So he's like ripping that up. He also, in his hand, he has something that says a veto. So this is what his opponents are making him look like. He's this authoritarian sort of King Andrew sort of character. So this cartoon right here is Jackson taking on the financial octopus of the bank. So it had all these different branches to it, and so he's fighting it, and he's trying to slay the King Bank. One of the people that's helping him is Martin Van Buren, the one person who Jackson is allied with in his administration. Now, one of the reasons that he hated the bank, aside from the fact that he thought that it was unconstitutional, it's run by elites and foreigners, was that the president of the bank he didn't like, Nicholas Biddle, because Biddle had used bank funds to support Jackson's political opponents. Also, Henry Clay, who backed the bank, had put forth, and Henry Clay didn't like Jackson. Henry Clay had put forth this Maysville Road project. It was supposed to be a road that went from Maysville, Ohio, to Henry Clay's hometown of Lexington, Kentucky. So Jackson vetoed that as well. So that is why Clay got on the side of Biddle to try to make Jackson look bad in this whole effort. And it backfired on Clay. Here's another image that shows Jackson is fighting the oppressive bank, right? This is the downfall of Mother Bank, and you have Van Buren there by his side. The guy that looks like the devil down there, that is supposed to be Nicholas Biddle. He's running away from Jackson as the bank collapses around him. So the people who supported Jackson believed that this was a good thing. They wanted to get rid of the bank. So then we get the presidential election of 1832, and as you can see, Jackson wins by a pretty huge margin. He gets 76% of the popular vote, which at this time, South Carolina, I don't think that they had the popular vote there, but 54%, or I'm sorry, 76% of the electoral vote and 54% of the popular vote. So Jackson wins pretty handily. We do at this time, we have a solid two-party system that emerges where we have the Democrats, they've dropped the Democratic Republicans, and then the Whigs. Now this Whig party emerges in the 1830s, 1850s, and it's a lot like following the Federalist Party. They supported the American system, Henry Clay's American system, where you would have a tariff, internal improvement, and then also a bank, right? So they wanted these things, and Jackson's getting rid of the bank. So this party formed, they called themselves the Whigs because the Whigs were the party in Parliament during the American Revolution that was in opposition to the king. And so this plays upon the Whigs' sort of accusations of Andrew Jackson acting like a king. So they favor that American system. They favor many of the policies of Alexander Hamilton and then also of Henry Clay. Later, it's going to morph into the Republican Party, which is anti-slavery. as opposed to the Democratic Party, which is supporting slavery, especially those Democrats in the South. So anyway, so these Whigs include Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott, and then later Abraham Lincoln. So here are the differences in the political parties, who their supporters are, or the issues that they supported, their concerns, and their voter base, so who their supporters are. So the Democrats, they wanted local rule, states' rights, limited government, free trade. They didn't want the tariff. They also wanted all these opportunities for white males, such as land on Indian property. They were opposed to monopolies and the national bank and high tariffs and high land prices. And most of these people were in the South and in the West, but in urban cities, they were the workers at these factories. The Whigs, on the other hand, they supported the American system, the national bank, federal funds for internal improvements, and a protective tariff. They also were opposed to all this widespread immigration and the crime that came with that. Most of these people were in New England, the Mid-Atlantic states. A lot of them were Protestant and of English heritage and urban professionals, business owners, those sorts of things. So anyway, on Jackson's second term, he wants to destroy the bank. Not only did he veto the bank's recharter for 1836, it's like, we're just going to get rid of it now that you bring it up. And so what he does is he pulls all the money out of the bank and to try to ruin it. It was probably illegal. He goes through a couple of Secretary of the Treasuries to do it, and the one that does do it is Roger B. Taney, who later he's going to appoint as the Chief Justice to the Supreme Court. So he does that, and then he puts in all these banks that he chooses, known as pet banks. So we were getting high inflation at this time, and to try to curb it, what he does too is he issues this specie circular saying you can only buy federal land with gold and silver. Well, nobody had gold and silver. So what happened, it causes these banknotes to lose all of their value by doing that. And so what happens is the value of the land just plummets. And we just get, it's a cyclical thing where we get all these financial problems. What it's going to eventually do is result in the Panic of 1837. So then we get the presidential election of 1836, and Jackson handpicks his successor, Martin Van Buren. The Whigs nominate 3 candidates, believing that that will split the vote, and Van Buren won't get the majority of the electoral vote. It backfired on them. So Van Buren becomes president, but then what we're going to see during his first year in office is the Panic of 1837. This is caused by the bank war, speculation, the specie circular, all these different financial problems that were taking place abroad. And then banks were calling in their loans because the national bank was calling in loans because all the funds were out. These other banks didn't have the money, so they're calling in loans from people they had lent money to. These people didn't have the money. The banks are going to go belly up, and eventually the national bank is going to also cease to exist. Another thing that caused problems was that the wheat crop failed because there was this Hessian fly that infested the wheat crop and killed it. So as a result of this, we get widespread unemployment. This was problematic now because we're an industrialized nation. There's so many people living in urban areas, and they can't just support themselves on their rural farms. So we have a lot of homeless, we have a lot of people going hungry, and so there's just widespread panic and problems throughout. Factories close, and politically this looks really bad for Van Buren. So that brings us to the election of 1840, and the Whigs choose this guy, William Henry Harrison, who was a war hero of the War of 1812 because he fought Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe, Battle of the Thames. He's old, he's 68 years old. They do all this newfangled campaigning, right? Their slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because they use Tippecanoe because that's the hero, he was the hero of that battle, but also John Tyler is his running mate, so they put that Tyler too. So they campaign and they go around the country with these log cabins on wheels, right? Campaign buttons, hard cider, all sorts of different things. The Democrats chose Van Buren to run again for a second term, and they did, their campaign slogan was just criticism of Harrison as being this old farmer who should be content with his pension, log cabin, and his hard cider. And then if you look right here, this is the election of 1840. William Henry Harrison wins, kind of turns things over. Electoral vote says here 80%. I have 78. Oh, turnout. There's 78% of the population turned out. The Whigs are now established as a national party. So they're out on the forefront of politics there, defeating the Democrats. Harrison comes in, he gives this long 2-hour inaugural address. He participates in the parade. He goes to these balls to celebrate his inauguration, but then he gets sick. Many people think that he ends up with pneumonia, and 31 days later, he dies. John Tyler, becomes the president, but he's kind of a Whig in name only. So all these Whigs don't really like him as the president, and they oppose him, and they actually kick him out of their party. So it's very difficult for the next few years, and as you're going to see in the next period, it becomes very problematic because he annexes Texas, and a lot is going to take place at that time. Okay, thanks for listening.